Hi, this is Claudine from Homespun Couture. So I'm at the point in my project where I want to start dyeing some of my yarn. Now, I'm going to have a two-color fair isle, and the vast majority of the sweater is going to be that two-color fair isle. So I have this black border Leicester, and I have this white texel. And you know, the black is probably more gray, the white is probably more cream, but we'll just call them black and white. But I also want to have, in the design I thought up, I want to have one stripe of a contrast color, which I want to be like an orangey red. So I have this one skein of the texel yarn, and I don't know if you'll be able to see this, but it's actually discolored. This one is darker than this one. It's discolored because when I was carding this yarn, I had tried to clean my carder, tried to clean the rust off of it, and I thought that I wasn't successful in cleaning the rust off, but apparently I was, but it had to wait until I ran some yarn through it. So basically this is just rust from my carder that is discoloring it. So I figured this would be a good skein to dye. Now I want to go for like an orangey red color. So as you can see, I have lots of dye that I've collected over the years. So I'm going to go for this cayenne red, and I'm going to just add a little yellow in this duckling and see if that gets me my orangey red color. Now the first thing I have to do is give this a really good wash. I washed the fleece initially, and the way I wash my fleece, I'm not super diligent about it, and so the fleece still feels a little bit oily from the lanolin. I like that. I like that lanolin feel, especially when I'm spinning. It makes my hands feel really soft. I even like it in the finished garment, but oil is kind of the enemy of dye. So the first thing I need to do is wash it in hot water and really serious detergent. So I have this Synthropol detergent, which is a really serious grease cutter. So that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to wash this in the Synthropol and rinse it a couple times. So now I'm going to start mixing the dye. Now, I like to do all of my dye mixing inside the slop sink because if dye starts going everywhere, you'll never get it out. So I do it in the sink. So I have this olive jar, and the first thing I'm going to do is spoon some dye into it. Now, for one skein of yarn, a teaspoon of dye is like a ton. So I don't know how much that is, half a teaspoon maybe. And then I want to mix it with the yellow color. So I'm going to take a different spoon, spoon it into, so it's maybe like a quarter teaspoon, I'm not sure. And then I take boiling water. I know the directions say you don't really have to use boiling water, but it says, the directions say something like, if it doesn't mix, you can try boiling water. So I just do boiling water initially. Now I have a bunch of kitchen utensils that are only for dyeing. Mostly I got them at garage sales or estate sales. Never use your utensils that you use food on for dyeing. Only use dedicated ones. So I have this beater. I have this, it's actually a hand drill that I got at an estate sale. And I stick the beater on it and I use it to stir. Now, I'm going to do this for like 3 or 4 minutes. Because a lot of times the powders just don't want to dissolve. So I'm going to sit here and do this for a little while. So now I've been mixing this for a few minutes, and I think it's probably well enough mixed. I'm going to take this out. And again, I just leave everything in the sink. And so I have this pan. I only use this pan for dyeing. I'm going to pour my dye into the pan. And it looks pretty good. I like to look at the bottom of the jar and see if there are any sort of undissolved grains of dye, and I don't see any, so that's always a good sign. So hot water, rinse out the jar, and then a little more hot water in the pan. You want to be able to submerge your skein of yarn or whatever it is you're dyeing. Now I have my skein of yarn that I just washed. It's over here on the other side of the sink, soaking. So I have my wet, clean skein of yarn. Now put it in, poke it down. Okay. And now I'm going to bring this upstairs and I'm going to put it on my stove. And I'm going to wait half an hour to an hour for the next step. Okay, so now it's about an hour later, and I have it on my stove. The heat is very low. You don't want it to boil, you just want to keep it warm. You can see if you lift it out, it's kind of a nice orange color. And you can see the water is very red. That indicates to me that, I mixed the two dyes. I mixed the yellow dye and the red dye. I think the uptake on the yellow dye has been better than the uptake on the red dye, and that more red remains in the water and more yellow is on my wool, which is fine at this point. So it's been here for like an hour, just in hot water on the stove. Now this is acid dye, which means it needs acid to bond the dye molecules to the wool. The acid that I'm going to use is just plain white vinegar. I use about this much. And if you're gonna go the acid dye route, you should really read the directions, because I'm pretty sure I'm probably not following them very closely, but this is just kind of how I've always done it. And I've been using acid dye for a long time. So you kind of move your work out of the way a little bit, pour some in, swish it around, stir, and keep doing that until all the vinegar is gone. So move it aside, pour a little in, swish it around and stir. And after I'm done with this, after I pour all the vinegar in, I'm going to leave it on the stove for about another hour. And then I'm gonna take it off the stove and put a lid on the pan and leave it to cool overnight in the water. Quite often, there might still be some dye in the water. The water might still be red, even after it's been in the hot water for an hour. But then if I leave it overnight and I look at it the next morning, the water is clear. And that's kind of your goal. You want the water to be clear. You want all of the dye to have been taken up by the wool. So that's what I'm going to do. So now it's the next day, and so I left the dye bath on the stove for about another hour after I put the vinegar in, and then I covered it and I let it cool overnight. So this is what it looks like, and you can see that the water in the dye bath is a whole lot clearer than it was yesterday, which means that the dye molecules that were floating around in the water have now attached themselves to the wool. And you can see when I lift it out that it's a lot less yellowy and a lot more reddish than it was yesterday. So those dye molecules that were floating around yesterday were probably the red dye molecules. And the water, this isn't the best uptake I've ever seen. Sometimes I open it up and the water is completely clear, which I love. But this uptake is pretty good. That was sort of the right amount of dye that I put in. Now I'm going to rinse it a few times, make sure that all the loose dye is off of it, and I'm going to wash it using Synthropol, and then I'm going to rinse it again and dry it, and then I'll have some nice red wool for my red stripe on my sweater. So now I have this lovely orangey red yarn, which is just what I wanted. I put it back on my Swift because now I'm going to use my ball winder to wind it into a ball, which is much more useful than a skein.